They thought I would cry. They thought I would sit there, hands trembling, lips pressed together, and accept everything like an old woman with nowhere else to go. Brandon stood in the corner with the smile I'd seen for 30 years, the smile of someone who believed he'd won before the game even began. But Harold, the man I loved more than anything in the world, spent the last 2 years of his life preparing for something no one in that room could have ever imagined, not even me. If you're reading this story, please like and comment the name of the city you're in, so I know how far my story has come. And please don't go anywhere, because what happened in that room on that November morning, it will change everything. I want to tell you something about grief that nobody warns you about. It doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't crash into you like a wave and then pull back. It seeps. It comes in at 3 in the morning when you reach for the other side of the bed and find it cold. It comes when you pour 2 cups of coffee out of habit and then stand there in the kitchen holding one of them, feeling like a fool. It comes when you catch yourself about to call his name down the hallway, and then you remember, and the remembering hits you somewhere behind the sternum that no doctor can touch. Harold Whitmore died on a Tuesday in October, 11 months before the day that would rearrange the rest of my life. He had been sick for 2 years. We knew it was coming. Knowing doesn't help. I need you to understand that. People say that. They say at least you had time to say goodbye. At least you had time to prepare. But you cannot prepare to lose the person who has been your anchor for 33 years. You can make practical arrangements. You can handle the paperwork, talk to the doctors, sit through the meetings with the estate lawyer, and nod at all the right moments. But you cannot prepare your chest for the emptiness that moves in and never quite leaves. Harold and I met when I was 26 years old. I was working at a small accounting firm in Millhaven, a mid-sized city that most people drove through without stopping. And he walked in one afternoon needing help with the books for a company he was just starting. He was 31. He had a second-hand briefcase, a plan that most people would have called reckless, and a kind of quiet confidence that I had never encountered before. Not arrogance. Confidence. There's a difference. And it took me years of living with Brandon to fully understand what that difference looked like. We married 2 years later. I left my job because Harold's company, Whitmore Industries, which had started as a small manufacturing operation, began growing faster than either of us had imagined, and the business needed both of us. I was never the face of it. I never wanted to be. I handled the internal accounts, the contracts, the fine print that Harold always said made his eyes cross. He said I had a mind that could smell a dishonest number from across a room. I took that as the highest compliment he ever gave me. Brandon was Harold's son from a brief first marriage. He was 7 when Harold and I wed. I want to be honest here, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes this story worth telling. I tried with Brandon. I genuinely tried. I read books about step-parenting. I gave him space when he needed it and attention when he seemed to want it. I never tried to replace his mother, who had moved away and was only intermittently present in his life. But Brandon had decided something about me before he was old enough to articulate it, and he never changed his mind. I was the woman who had taken his father. I was the woman who didn't belong. And as he got older, as Harold made him a junior executive at Whitmore Industries and then a senior one, Brandon grew into a man who believed that everything Harold had built was his by birthright, including the right to treat me like furniture. I don't say that lightly. Eleanor. That's how he addressed me. Not Mom, not even Mrs. Whitmore, which at least would have had some formality to it. Just Eleanor, said in a tone that made my name sound like a minor inconvenience. At company dinners, he would talk across me. At family holidays, he would make decisions about where we sat, what we ate, how long we stayed, as if I were a guest who hadn't been properly invited. Harold noticed. I know he noticed because sometimes he would reach under the table and put his hand over mine, and that was his way of saying, I see it, Eleanor. I see it, and I'm sorry. He never confronted Brandon directly. That was Harold's one failure with his son. He loved Brandon too much to hold him accountable, and that love, unchecked, untempered, had grown Brandon into exactly the kind of man Harold should have feared. But Harold was smarter than anyone gave him credit for, including Brandon. The autumn that Harold died, Whitmore Industries was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million. It employed 312 people. It had contracts with 6 regional distributors, and was in early negotiations with a national partner that could have tripled the company's reach inside of 5 years. Brandon knew all of this. He had been positioning himself for years. When Harold's diagnosis came, pancreatic, advanced, the kind of news that a doctor delivers in a careful tone while keeping a box of tissues within arm's reach, Brandon's concern was genuine for approximately 3 weeks. I watched it happen. I watched my stepson sit at his father's bedside and hold Harold's hand and look appropriately devastated. And I don't think it was entirely performance. I think Brandon did love his father, in whatever way Brandon was capable of love. But I also watched his eyes when the doctors used words like terminal and timeline. There was something moving behind those eyes that had nothing to do with grief. 2 weeks after the diagnosis, Brandon came to the house for dinner and steered the conversation toward the company's succession plan. Harold was sitting across the table, thinner already, and he just looked at his son with an expression I couldn't fully read. Then he picked up his fork and said, "We'll handle things properly, Brandon. Don't worry." And that was that. I learned later that Harold had spent the following morning on the phone with Victor Hale, the family's estate attorney. I didn't know what they discussed. Not then. Harold died at home, which was what he wanted. I was holding his hand. There was nothing cinematic about it. He didn't give a final speech or say something profound that I could carry with me forever. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in his eyes something that I can only describe as peace mixed with regret, and then he closed them. That was the morning of October 14th. The weeks that followed were the kind of blur that grief produces. Arrangements and phone calls and casseroles appearing on the doorstep from neighbors I barely knew, and the constant rotation of people through the house, all of them wanting to help in ways that required me to manage my own pain in order to accommodate theirs. I was polite, I was functional. I moved through those weeks like I was walking underwater. Brandon took charge of the company immediately. He didn't wait. Within 48 hours of Harold's passing, he was already at the office, already in Harold's chair, already making calls. I found out from Margaret Chen, Harold's longtime executive assistant, who called me the evening of the second day, sounding uncertain about whether she should say anything at all. "He moved some things around," Margaret said carefully. "Mr. Whitmore's Harold's personal items from the office. He said it was for the transition." I thanked her and hung up and sat with that information for a long time. Brandon came to the house 3 days after Harold's death. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where Harold and I had eaten breakfast together for 22 years. And he was wearing a suit, which he almost never did unless there was a meeting. He folded his hands on the table and said, "I think we need to talk about the estate process." "Victor's scheduling the reading for later this month," I said. "I assume you've spoken with him." "I have." He paused. "Look, Eleanor, I think we both know how Dad wanted things to go. He built that company. He always intended for it to stay in the family, in the Whitmore name. And I want to make sure we handle the transition in a way that honors that." I looked at him. "What exactly are you suggesting, Brandon?" "I'm not suggesting anything specific. I just think it would be good, cleaner, if we're both on the same page going in. The house is yours, obviously. Dad always said the old estate was yours. And I'll make sure you're taken care of financially. I just want the business to be positioned for the next phase." Taken care of. Like I was a problem to be managed, like I was an elderly relative being installed in a suitable facility so the real business could be conducted without interruption. "I appreciate you stopping by," I said. And then I stood up, which in my household had always been the signal that a conversation was over. Brandon's jaw tightened, but he stood. At the door, he turned back. "You know Dad loved you, but he was also a pragmatist. He understood what was necessary." "Yes," I said. "He did." I closed the door. And I stood in the hallway of the house where I had lived for 22 years, and I let myself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of what was coming. The reading of the will was scheduled for November 7th. Victor Hale's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, with tall windows that looked out over the river. I had been there twice before. Once when Harold updated the will after a significant business restructuring, and once for an unrelated contract matter. Both times I had sat in the chair nearest the window because the light was better there. I sat in the same chair on November 7th. The room held 8 people. Victor at the head of the table, of course. His associate, a young woman named Priya, whose last name I never caught, but who seemed competent and careful. Brandon, seated to Victor's left, in the kind of suit that costs more than most people's monthly rent. Brandon's wife, Claudia, who had the particular talent of expressing sympathy with her face while expressing contempt with every other part of her body. Harold's younger brother, Dennis, who had flown in from Phoenix and looked like he desperately wished he were still there. Dennis's wife, whose name was Linda and who had always been perfectly pleasant to me and would have been my ally in this room if alliances had been relevant. And two of Harold's longtime business associates, Frank Sorensen and Jim Albright, who had been included at Harold's specific request, according to Victor. I noted that last detail with interest. Brandon was talking when I came in. He was talking to Frank Sorensen, and it was the kind of talking that men do when they want to establish something without saying it directly. He was positioning himself, making clear to Frank that he was already in the chair, already in command, that the formality of today was simply the legal confirmation of what everyone in this room already understood to be true. He glanced at me when I sat down. His expression didn't change, which told me everything. Claudia offered me a small, careful smile. "Eleanor, you look well." "Thank you, Claudia." That was the entirety of our exchange. Victor opened the proceedings at 10 o'clock exactly. He was a precise man, Victor Hale, in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the demeanor of someone who had sat through enough of these rooms to be impervious to the specific atmosphere they generated. He said the necessary legal preambles. He confirmed the date of Harold's death, the validity of the document before him, the presence of all required parties. Then he put on his reading glasses and began. I had not seen the will. I want to be clear about that. Harold and I had spoken in general terms about his wishes, about the house, about the company, about what he hoped for. But he had always been gently, firmly evasive when I asked for specifics. "Trust me, Eleanor," he said once, about 6 months before he died. We were sitting on the back porch in the late evening, the summer air still warm. "I've been careful. I've been more careful than you know. I had trusted him." That was the beginning and end of it. What Victor read that morning, at least at first, was exactly what Brandon had been counting on. Whitmore Industries, its assets, its operations, its contracts, its leadership structure, was to pass to Brandon Whitmore, Harold's sole surviving heir from his first marriage. The transfer was to be effective immediately upon the probate process, subject to standard legal timelines. I watched Brandon's face as Victor read those words. He had been trying to look appropriately solemn, the way a person is supposed to look during the reading of a will, but he couldn't entirely suppress it. There was a faint loosening around his jaw, a slight settling of his shoulders, the physical expression of a man who has just received confirmation of something he has always believed to be his. He exhaled through his nose. He straightened his cuffs. Claudia placed her hand on top of his on the table. Then Victor continued. To Eleanor Whitmore, surviving spouse, Harold left the family estate, the old property outside of town that had been in Harold's family for 50 years, on 3 acres of land that the market had never been entirely sure what to do with. A paid-off house with drafty windows and a furnace that needed replacing, and a garden that I actually loved but that nobody else in that room would have valued. The old house, the property that Brandon had once, at a family dinner years earlier, called a money pit dressed up as nostalgia. I heard Dennis make a small sound across the table, not quite a gasp, but something adjacent to it. Linda's hand moved to her husband's arm. I did not react. I had been managing my face in rooms like this for 33 years. Brandon turned to look at me, and I want to tell you what was in his eyes at that moment, because it matters. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something more complicated than that. There was relief, that his calculation had been correct. There was a trace of genuine pity, because even Brandon, in his worst version of himself, wasn't entirely without feeling, but underneath both of those things, there was satisfaction. The satisfaction of the man who has spent decades watching and waiting and believing, and who has just been proved right. He turned back to Victor as if the matter were settled. Victor took off his reading glasses and cleaned them with the cloth he kept in his breast pocket. It was such an ordinary gesture, so mundane, so completely at odds with what he said next. There is a second document, Victor said. The room shifted. Brandon looked up. I'm sorry. Harold prepared a second document to be introduced at this point in the proceedings. Victor set his glasses back on. He was specific about the timing. He wanted the first portion of the will read and received before this document was introduced. What kind of document? Brandon's voice was careful, measured, but I heard the thing underneath it. A codicil and an associated disclosure, Victor said. Harold's instructions were that it be read in full, without interruption, in the presence of all parties currently in this room. He looked up over his glasses. I need everyone to remain seated. The silence that fell over that room was the kind that has texture to it. Frank Sorensen leaned forward slightly. Jim Albright set down the pen he had been turning between his fingers. Dennis and Linda exchanged a glance. Claudia's hand, I noticed, was no longer on top of Brandon's. I sat very still and looked at Victor Hale and waited. That's it. Before he read the second document, Victor reached into the folder beside him and produced a sealed envelope. He set it on the table in front of him without opening it. Harold also prepared a personal statement, Victor said, to be read following the legal documents. He asked that it be delivered in his own words. Brandon was staring at the envelope. Something had happened to the certainty in his face. It wasn't gone entirely. Brandon had always been a man who resettled his confidence quickly, who refused to let himself be visibly rattled for long. But for a moment, just a moment, he looked like a person who has just realized that the ground he's been standing on might not be entirely solid. He also left a message specifically for you, Eleanor, Victor added, meeting my eyes across the table. I had not known about the letter. My chest tightened around something I didn't have a name for. Let me begin with the codicil, Victor said. He picked up the second document and started reading. The legal language was dense, as legal language always is, full of whereases and heretofore and provisions and contingencies. I had spent enough years working with contracts to follow it, but I could see from the expressions around the table that Frank Sorensen was the only other person tracking it clearly. Everyone else was watching Victor's face for cues, waiting for the emotional temperature of the room to tell them how to feel before they fully understood what they were hearing. So let me tell you what it said, stripped of the legal architecture. Ownership of Whitmore Industries was being transferred to Brandon, but conditionally. Brandon would hold operational control of the company for a probationary period of exactly 12 months, during which he would be required to meet specific performance and conduct benchmarks that Victor would provide to him in a separate document. These benchmarks covered financial performance, employee retention, contract compliance, and ethical operating standards. If Brandon met the benchmarks at the 12-month mark, full ownership transferred to him permanently. If he failed to meet them on any single material point, ownership and control would transfer immediately to the surviving trustee named in an associated trust agreement. Brandon was listening with the particular focus of someone trying to process information faster than it's being delivered. What trust agreement? He said. What trustee? Victor held up one finger. Not a reprimand, but a signal. I'm getting there. He turned to the next page. The old estate, Victor continued, known as Hartwell House, was transferred to Eleanor Whitmore as described in the primary will. However, Harold wishes to disclose that Hartwell House contains within its title and deed a legally binding addendum executed in private in March of 2 years prior that establishes the Whitmore Family Trust. He paused. Eleanor Whitmore is named as the sole trustee of that trust. The room went completely quiet. And the trust, Victor said, reading slowly and clearly, holds the controlling interest in Whitmore Industries, specifically 43% of the outstanding shares, registered privately in the trust's name, transferred from Harold Whitmore's personal holdings over the course of 18 months, in compliance with applicable law. I heard Brandon say, "That's not," and then stop. Harold's instructions, Victor continued, are that Eleanor, as trustee, holds the authority to ratify or revoke Brandon's operational control at the conclusion of the 12-month period. She also holds the authority to intervene in the event of a material violation of the conduct benchmarks prior to that date. Victor set the document down. He looked around the room. Brandon was very still. It was Frank Sorensen who spoke first. Frank, who had known Harold for over 20 years, who had watched Whitmore Industries grow from a small operation into what it had become. He let out a long breath and said quietly, "You clever son of a gun, Harold." And something happened to me in that moment that I was not expecting. I'd been sitting in that chair managing my face and managing my breathing and managing the careful architecture of composure that I had constructed around myself over 33 years of difficult rooms. And then Frank said that, and something in my chest came loose, and I pressed my lips together very hard and looked at the window and the river beyond it, and I did not cry. I did not cry because I had promised myself I wouldn't, not there, not in front of them. But Harold had done all of this. He had spent 2 years while he was sick, while he was managing his own fear and his own pain, building this. Quietly. Carefully. Without telling me, because he knew that if he told me, I would have argued with him about it. I would have said it wasn't necessary. I would have said Brandon would be fine. I would have been wrong. Harold had known his son, and Harold had known me, and he had built something that trusted me to handle what came next. I pressed my fingers against the edge of the table and breathed through my nose and looked at the river. Brandon found his voice approximately 45 seconds later. He stopped, started again. Victor, this needs to be reviewed. I need my own attorney to look at these documents before— You are welcome to have any attorney review them, Victor said calmly. Harold anticipated that possibility. The documents are airtight. They were reviewed by 3 separate legal teams over the course of 14 months. 14 months, Brandon repeated the number slowly. His voice had gone flat. Harold was thorough, Victor said. The shares— Brandon's jaw was tight. Those shares were he never disclosed. The transfers were executed legally, in compliance with all applicable regulations, and filed with the appropriate authorities. They are a matter of record, Brandon. Harold simply chose not to discuss them with you. I watched my stepson absorb this. I watched the calculation behind his eyes. I had been watching Brandon calculate for 25 years, so I knew the look. He was searching for the angle, the challenge, the argument that would reframe this in his favor. He was a man who had never lost in a way he couldn't redefine as temporary, and he was trying to find that redefinition now. Eleanor. He turned to me, and his voice, when he said my name, was different from every other time he had said it in 33 years. The contempt was still there, that was so deeply wired into him that I don't think he could have removed it if he'd wanted to. But there was something else now, something that sat underneath the contempt like water under ice. Did you know about this? I looked at him for a moment. I thought about all the dinners, all the holidays, all the times he had talked across me, around me, through me, all the times he had said Eleanor in that tone, all the casually delivered insults about the house, about my age, about my relevance, delivered with a smile that gave him plausible deniability. No, I said. I didn't. He studied my face, looking for the lie. He didn't find it because it wasn't there. Well, he said, and I could hear him rebuilding the structure of his confidence around the new information, brick by brick. Well, this doesn't change anything operationally. The company is still mine to run. That's clear. For 12 months, Victor said. Conditionally. The benchmarks are reasonable. I'll meet them. I hope you do, Victor said, and something about the way he said it, quiet, sincere, a little sad, made Brandon look at him sharply. Victor picked up the sealed envelope. He looked at me. Eleanor, would you like me to read the personal statement now, or would you prefer to receive it privately? I thought about this. Around the table, 8 people were watching me. The widow who had just discovered that her dead husband had left her a weapon she hadn't known she was holding. Read it, I said. Victor opened the envelope. Harold's handwriting was on the paper inside. Victor had a typed transcript, but he held the handwritten original up briefly so I could see it. So I would know it was real, was Harold's hand, was his actual penmanship that I had watched move across hundreds of documents over 3 decades. Victor read, "To my family and to anyone present today, I want to be honest with you in this letter in a way that I was not always honest in life, and I want to start by saying that I am sorry for the dishonesty. Silence is a form of dishonesty, and I was silent too long about things that mattered. To my son, Brandon, I love you. That is not complicated. What is complicated is that love by itself is not sufficient preparation for leadership. I gave you the opportunity to learn, and I gave you the authority before you had earned the judgment to use it wisely. That was my failure as your father, not yours as a person. You're capable of more than what you have been. I am asking you, through this process, to find out what that looks like. To my Eleanor, you were the most competent, steadfast, and decent person I have ever known. I should have told you that more often, and in more specific terms, instead of assuming you understood. You do understand because you are Eleanor, and Eleanor understands everything eventually. But you deserve to hear it said. The old house is your house. It always was. Everything else is a formality. Take care of my company, my dear. Take care of the people in it. You know how. Victor folded the transcript and set it on the table. The room was very quiet. I looked at the envelope in Victor's hands, the one with Harold's handwriting on it, and I thought, 33 years. 33 years, and he still managed to say something that undid me completely in front of 8 people. I kept my face still, but it was the hardest thing I had done in a long time. Brandon was looking at the table. Claudia was looking at Brandon. Dennis was looking at the window. Linda had tears on her face, which surprised me, and I found that I was grateful for them. Frank Sorensen reached across the table and put his hand briefly over mine. Harold was one of a kind, he said. Yes, I said. He was. The meeting concluded 20 minutes later after Victor walked through the procedural next steps, the probate timeline, the documentation Brandon would receive regarding the benchmarks, the process by which the trust would be verified and registered. It was administrative and necessary, and I absorbed every word of it, because that was what Harold had asked me to do. Take care of the people in it. You know how? Brandon and Claudia left without speaking to me. I watched them from Victor's window. Brandon's shoulders set, his walk carrying the particular rigidity of a man who is refusing to let his body express what he's actually feeling. Claudia put her hand on his arm in the elevator lobby, and he shook it off, gently but clearly. Dennis embraced me on the way out. He smelled like the same aftershave he'd been wearing since the 80s, and I found that detail unexpectedly steadying. He was a smart man, your husband, Dennis said into my shoulder. He was, I said. You okay? I pulled back and looked at my brother-in-law's tired, travel-worn face. He was a good person, Dennis. Not complicated, not particularly equipped to navigate the specific terrain of the Whitmore family drama, but genuinely good. I'm getting there, I said. Victor walked me to the elevator himself, which wasn't necessary but was kind. At the door, he handed me a manila folder, the trust documentation, the legal description of the controlling shares, the records of Harold's transfers. He asked me to make sure you had time to review these privately before Brandon's attorneys started making requests, Victor said, which will happen soon. I know. I held the folder against my chest. He also asked me to tell you something, off the record, not in the letter. Victor looked at me steadily. He said, Tell Eleanor that the house has good bones. She always knew that. She just needs to look in the right room. I stared at him. What does that mean? I suspect you'll figure it out, Victor said. Harold thought you would. He pressed the elevator button. He usually thought right. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in. I pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, I looked down at the folder in my hands. 43%. 312 employees. A 12-month clock. And somewhere in the walls of that old house, something Harold had left for me to find. I had walked into that room that morning as a widow with a property nobody wanted. I walked out of it as something else entirely. But I want to be honest with you, the way Harold asked me to be. I was not calm. I was not triumphant. I was not the composed, quietly powerful woman that this story might make me sound like in that moment. I walked to my car in the parking structure, sat in the driver's seat, and shook for 15 minutes. Because it's one thing to discover that someone loved you enough to build a fortress around you without telling you. It's another thing entirely to realize you have to live up to it. The old house was waiting for me across town, with its drafty windows and its paid-off deed and its secrets still folded inside its walls. I put the car in drive. Annette. The drive from Victor's office to Hartwell House took 22 minutes on a good day. That afternoon it took me 37, because I took the long way without meaning to. I missed a turn somewhere on Callaway Street and didn't correct it, just kept driving, past the old hardware store that had been there since I moved to Millhaven and the diner where Harold and I used to go on Sunday mornings in the early years when we didn't yet have enough money to feel comfortable but had enough of everything else that it didn't matter. I needed the extra time. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere around the second traffic light, but my mind was still moving too fast for a 22-minute drive to contain it. Harold had transferred 43% of his own company's shares, over 18 months, quietly, legally, without a word to anyone. Not to Brandon, not to his attorney's wider circle, not to me. He had dismantled a piece of himself piece by piece and placed it somewhere safe, in my name, inside a house that everyone had dismissed as a consolation prize. I kept thinking about the way he said things, the specific economy of Harold's language, the way he could pack a meaning into a sentence that other people would need a paragraph to approximate. The house has good bones. She always knew that. She just needs to look in the right room. What room, Harold? I thought, turning finally onto the long gravel driveway that cut through the overgrown front property. What room did you put it in? Hartwell House came into view the way it always did, gradually, through the old oak trees that lined the drive, revealing itself in pieces rather than all at once. It was a large house, or had been once, built in the 1930s by Harold's grandfather and maintained with decreasing enthusiasm by each subsequent generation. The white paint had gone the color of old cream. The porch steps had a soft spot in the middle that I had been carefully stepping around for 6 years. The garden in the back, which I had worked at alone every spring, was the most alive thing on the property. I sat in the car for a moment after I parked, looking at the front door. "Okay," I said out loud, to nobody. To Harold, maybe, wherever he was. "Okay, I'm here." I went inside. The house felt different that evening. I know that sounds like the kind of thing a person says in a story when they want to signal that everything has changed, and I'm aware of how it sounds, but it was true. Or maybe I was different inside it. I had lived in this house for the last 4 years since Harold's health made the larger property in town difficult to manage, and we'd retreated here to the old family place. I knew every creak in its floors, every draft in its hallways. But I walked through the front door that evening and felt something I could only describe as a presence. Not supernatural. I don't believe in that sort of thing, and Harold didn't either. Just the accumulated weight of intention. Harold had been in this house during those 18 months. He had moved things. He had placed something here. I set my bag and the folder from Victor on the kitchen table and made coffee, because I needed something to do with my hands while I thought. The kitchen was where Harold and I had spent most of our time at Hartwell House. It was the warmest room, facing south, and it caught the afternoon light until nearly 5 in winter. I had a memory of him at this same counter 2 summers ago, his reading glasses on, going through a document. He'd covered it when I walked in. I had thought nothing of it at the time because Harold was always working, always reviewing something, and I had learned in 33 years to give him space to think. Now I sat with my coffee and I thought about that moment very carefully. He'd covered the document. I put my coffee down and went to his study. Harold's study was the room I had changed the least since his death. Partly sentimentality, I won't pretend otherwise, but also something else, something more practical. An instinct maybe that the room wasn't finished yet, that there was still a reason to leave it as it was. The study was lined with bookshelves on 3 walls, floor to ceiling, the books organized in a system that only Harold fully understood, but that I had absorbed enough of over the years to navigate. His desk was a large oak piece, solid and scarred, that he'd had since before I met him. The center drawer was locked. It had always been locked, and Harold had kept the key on his personal keychain, which I now kept in the ceramic bowl by the front door with the spare house key and 3 loose buttons I'd never thrown away. I went and got the keychain. The lock was stiff. I had to apply real pressure before it gave, and when it did, the drawer slid open with the particular sound of old wood that hasn't moved in a while. Inside was the expected archive of a careful man, a yellow legal pad with notes I couldn't immediately decode, a small address book, 3 pens, a USB drive in a paper sleeve, a folded map of the property, and a white envelope with my name on it in Harold's handwriting. Different from the one Victor had read, this one was sealed with wax, old-fashioned dark green wax, the color Harold always chose for important things. He had a seal in the shape of a small compass rose. He'd bought it at an estate sale 20 years ago, and I had always thought it was an affectation. Now it felt like a signal. My name, Eleanor. In the handwriting I knew better than my own, I sat down in his chair, The chair I had sat across from for 33 years, never in, and I held the envelope for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, dated 8 months before he died. I'm not going to read it to you in full. Some of it is mine, just mine, and I need to keep that. But I'll tell you what was relevant, what changed things further, what confirmed everything I had started to understand in Victor's office. Harold told me about the shares. He explained in his careful, methodical way how he had executed the transfers, the legal structure of the trust, the reasoning behind registering it through the house rather than directly. He named 3 attorneys who could corroborate the documentation if needed. He named the specific file boxes in the study. I looked up and saw them immediately, 4 identical dark green archival boxes on the second shelf, labeled with dates where the original paper trail was stored. He told me why he hadn't told me in person. He said, "I know you, Eleanor. If I told you, you would have tried to protect Brandon from it. You would have said it wasn't necessary. You have always been more generous with my son than he deserved, and I love you for it, but I needed to do this without your generosity getting in the way." I laughed at that, alone in his study. It came out wrong, too close to crying. I pressed my hand against my mouth and breathed through it. And then he told me one more thing. He said that in the study's closet, behind the winter coats on the left-hand side, there was a locked fireproof box. The second key on the keychain, the small one I had always assumed was for a padlock somewhere, opened it. Inside was a second USB drive with a recorded video statement, notarized digital copies of all trust documents, and a letter from a legal team in the state capitol that had served as the independent oversight on the whole arrangement. He told me to make copies. He told me to give 1 set to Victor, 1 set to a safe deposit box, and to keep 1 set at the house. "Do not give Brandon access to this material until he has earned it," he wrote. "You will know when and if that time comes." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Then I went to the closet and found the box. Tom, I was still in the study at 9:30 that evening, going through the file boxes, when my phone rang. Brandon. I looked at the screen. I thought about not answering. Then I picked up, because avoiding the conversation would only delay it, and I had learned a long time ago that delayed conversations with Brandon had a way of arriving later in worse condition. "I've been trying to reach you since 4 o'clock, he said. "I know. I've been home. I need to meet with you. Tomorrow. I'd like to bring Claudia and our attorney." "Your attorney?" I kept my voice level. "You've already retained an attorney." "It's a reasonable step, Eleanor, under the circumstances." "It is," I said. "Have your attorney contact Victor Hale. That's the appropriate channel." There was a silence. When Brandon spoke again, his voice had changed. The professional surface had thinned, and underneath it was something rawer. "I need you to understand something. Dad built that company. I have worked in it for 15 years. I know every contract, every supplier, every employee. Whatever legal arrangement he created, I am the one who has the operational knowledge. I am the one who can actually run it. Brandon, I am not going to let you take this from me." The words landed the way he intended them to, like a warning. But I noticed something, the way you notice the specific shape of an injury. He had said, "Take this from me," as if I had moved against him, as if I were the aggressor in a situation that his own father had constructed. "I'm not taking anything from you," I said. "Your father left you the company. You have the opportunity to run it for 12 months and prove yourself. If you do that, if you genuinely do that, then it transfers to you permanently. That's what Harold wanted. With you as the backstop, with you holding the threat over my head for an entire year. That's not how I intend to operate." "I don't know what you intend." His voice tightened. "That's the problem, Eleanor. I don't know you. I've never actually known you. You've been in my father's house for 33 years, and I still don't know who you are or what you want." That one actually surprised me. Not because it was an attack. I had been absorbing Brandon's attacks for years, but because buried inside the hostility was something that sounded almost honest. He didn't know me. He had spent 3 decades not looking at me clearly enough to know me, and now he was standing in the wreckage of that oversight and calling it my failure. "I want the company to survive," I said. "I want the 312 people who work there to keep their jobs. I want Harold's 30 years of work to mean something. That's what I want." Another silence, longer this time. "He should have told me," Brandon said finally. His voice was different, quieter, and rougher, the way a voice gets when a person is working very hard not to fracture. He should have talked to me. If he had concerns, if he thought I wasn't... He stopped. He should have talked to me. Maybe he tried, I said, in his way. I don't know why I said that. It wasn't strategic. It was just true. Harold had tried, in his careful, indirect way, to signal things to Brandon for years. Brandon had never been able to hear it, and now Harold was gone, and the message had been delivered through the legal system instead of through conversation, and there was nothing to be done about that now. Brandon hung up without saying goodbye, which was fine. I had 33 years of experience with Brandon's exits. I put the phone down and looked at the open file boxes around me and thought about what Harold had written. You will know when and if that time comes. I was beginning to think I would know, but that time was not now. The weeks that followed were educational, which is a polite way of saying they were difficult in a number of ways I had not fully anticipated. Brandon's attorney, a sharp-elbowed man named Richard Coates, who had a reputation in Millhaven for being aggressive in proportion to what he was billing, sent Victor a 40-page document within 5 days of the will reading. I read it over a weekend. It challenged the validity of the share transfers on 3 separate grounds, questioned the timing of the trust's establishment in relation to Harold's declining health, and contained a section that I found particularly notable. It suggested that Harold had been in a compromised mental state during the period in which the trust was set up, and that undue influence could not be ruled out. Undue influence, my influence, over Harold. I read that section twice, sitting at the kitchen table in Hartwell House, and I felt something that I want to be precise about. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was more like the particular exhaustion of being accused of a thing so far from reality that you don't even know where to begin dismantling it. I had spent 33 years supporting Harold's decisions, including ones I disagreed with. I had never once redirected a business choice for personal gain. The records were there. The 33 years of records were there for anyone who wanted to look at them. I called Victor. It's a standard challenge, Victor said. They're testing the structure. Richard Coates always files the broadest possible opening document and then retreats to what's defensible. It's theater. It doesn't feel like theater. No, Victor acknowledged. It wouldn't from where you're sitting. But Eleanor, Harold had 3 legal teams review this over 14 months. 2 of them were specifically tasked with anticipating challenges of exactly this kind. The documentation of his mental capacity during those 18 months is thorough. His doctors wrote statements. There are dated records of every transfer. There's a video of Harold, taken 11 months before his death, in which he explains his reasoning in his own words while clearly and demonstrably competent. He made a video. He was Harold, Victor said, and I could hear the quiet affection in it. He documented everything. I exhaled. Okay. There's something else. Victor's voice shifted slightly, into the register he used when he was about to deliver something that required my full attention. Brandon has already begun making changes at the company. Margaret Chen called me this morning. Margaret again. I had spoken to her twice since the will reading. Brief calls, careful and coded, the kind of communication between 2 people who were both navigating something they didn't yet fully understand. She was loyal to the company, not to Brandon specifically, and I think she was trying to figure out where the solid ground was. What kind of changes? I asked. He's restructured 2 of the senior department heads, moved them sideways, installed his own people, and he's in preliminary discussions with a buyer for the Eastern distribution contracts, the regional ones Harold had built over 15 years. I stood up from the kitchen table. He's selling the distribution contracts? Preliminary discussions. Nothing signed. Those contracts represent almost 1/3 of the company's stable revenue. Harold spent... I stopped. Breathed. Victor, the benchmarks. Is this a violation of the benchmarks? It approaches one, Victor said carefully. A signed sale would almost certainly constitute a violation. At this stage, I would say he's walking very close to the line, whether he knows it or not. He knows, I said. A pause. Probably, Victor agreed. I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden, which was brown and dormant in November, waiting for the spring. I wasn't sure I was ready to think about. 312 employees. 15 years of distribution relationships Harold had built by driving to meetings himself and shaking hands and following up and proving over and over that Whitmore Industries was reliable in a way that a lot of companies weren't. "What are my options at this stage?" I asked. "As trustee, you can issue a formal notice through me to Whitmore Industries indicating your intent to monitor the benchmark conditions closely. It's not an intervention, but it establishes the record and it signals that I'm watching." "Yes, do it," I said. The notice went out on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Brandon had called me 4 times. I returned the 4th call. "This is harassment," he said. The professional distance was gone. He wasn't trying for it anymore. "It's a legal notification from the trustee of your father's estate," I said. "Victor can explain the distinction. You're doing this because you resent me. You have always resented me." The absurdity of it was so complete that for a moment I didn't have an answer. I had been the one resented. I had spent 33 years being the subject of Brandon's resentment and absorbing it as gracefully as I could, and now I was standing in his father's study, surrounded by his father's careful documentation, being told that my resentment was the problem. "I'm doing this because I have a legal responsibility to the company your father built," I said, "and because the distribution contracts are not yours to sell. They are absolutely mine to—" "Brandon," I kept my voice steady. "Listen to me carefully. I don't want to be in conflict with you. That has never been what I wanted. But if you sell those contracts, you will have triggered a benchmark violation, and I will have no choice but to act on it. That is not a threat. That is the structure your father put in place, and my obligation is to honor it." Silence. "He really thought I would fail," Brandon said. He wasn't talking to me anymore, not exactly. It was the sound of a person arriving at a conclusion that had been waiting for them. He set all of this up because he thought I would fail. I considered several answers. The honest one was complicated. "I think he thought you might," I said finally. "And I think he wanted to make sure there was something in place if you did. That's not the same as expecting failure. That's being careful with something that mattered." Another silence. Longer. "The distribution discussions are on hold," Brandon said. His voice had gone flat and controlled. "For now." "Thank you," I said. He hung up. I set the phone on Harold's desk and sat in Harold's chair and looked at the 4 green archival boxes, all the careful work Harold had done to protect what he'd built. "The house has good bones," he'd said. She always knew that. I was starting to understand what I was holding, not just the legal weight of it, the shares, the trust, the authority, but the actual thing Harold had handed me. He hadn't left me a weapon. He'd left me a responsibility. And the difference between those 2 things was going to determine what came next. Outside, the November dark was coming down early over the garden, and somewhere across town, in the office building where Harold had worked for 30 years, his son was sitting in his chair trying to figure out how to beat a game that his father had already finished designing. I opened the first archival box and started reading. The archival boxes took me 3 weeks to get through properly. Not because the material was difficult to understand. Harold's filing system was meticulous, the kind of organized that only happens when a person has decided to build something meant to outlast them. But because I kept stopping. I would pull out a document and find Harold's handwriting in the margins, a note he'd made to himself about a decision or a concern, and I would sit with it for 10 minutes before I could move forward. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. It finds you in the margins of things. By the end of those 3 weeks, I knew the company better than I had since the early years when I was still doing the internal accounts. I knew which contracts were healthy and which were being quietly mismanaged. I knew which supplier relationships were solid and which had started to wobble in the months since Harold's death. I knew, from Margaret Chen's careful and increasingly frequent phone calls, that 2 of the senior department heads Brandon had moved sideways were the most experienced operational minds in the building, and that the people he'd installed in their place were younger, cheaper, and personally loyal to Brandon in a way that had nothing to do with competence. I knew, in other words, exactly what was happening, and I was watching it with the specific helplessness of someone who has the authority to intervene, but not yet the justification. Because Brandon had not, in those first weeks, crossed a line clearly enough to trigger the benchmarks. He was doing what Brandon had always done, operating right at the edge of what was acceptable, with enough technical deniability to make any challenge difficult. Harold had known he would do this. I was certain of it. Harold had watched his son navigate the borders of acceptable behavior for 30 years. What Harold had also known, I was beginning to understand, was that Brandon couldn't sustain it indefinitely. That was the real design of the 12 months. Not punishment, not a trap. A long enough window that Brandon's own nature would eventually do the work. I just had to wait. Waiting, it turns out, is its own kind of labor. Bombed. December came in cold that year. I spent Christmas at Dennis and Linda's house in Phoenix. Dennis had insisted, Linda had called separately to reinforce the insistence, and I had eventually agreed because the alternative was Hartwell House alone with Harold's study and the archival boxes and the particular silence of a house that is waiting for something. Brandon and Claudia were not there. We had a family holiday in which nobody mentioned the obvious absence directly, which meant it was mentioned constantly in every other way. Dennis's adult children, I had 3 nieces and nephews on that side, all in their 30s, all with children of their own, were careful around me in the way that people are when they're aware of a situation and haven't decided how they feel about it yet. On Christmas Eve, Dennis's daughter, Rebecca, sat next to me on the back porch while the younger children were being put to bed inside. She was 34, a straightforward woman who taught high school chemistry and had always struck me as the most direct member of her generation of the family. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Do you feel bad?" "About Brandon, I mean. About the way it came out." I thought about that. The honest answer was complicated, and I didn't want to give her the dishonest one. "I feel a lot of things," I said. "Bad isn't exactly the word I'd use. I feel responsible. I feel like I'm holding something that Harold built very carefully, and I don't want to drop it." "But do you think it was fair? What Harold did to Brandon?" I looked out at the dark yard. I think Harold made the decision he thought was right for the company and the people in it. I think he made it with more information about his son than anyone else had. And I think that whatever it feels like to Brandon right now, it's not a punishment. It's an opportunity. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Brandon called my dad last month. Did you know that?" I hadn't known. "What did he say?" "He said you were trying to steal his inheritance." Those were the words he used. He asked Dad to testify on his behalf if it went to court. Something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the December air. "What did Dennis say?" "He said he wasn't going to get involved." She paused. "He also said he'd seen the way Brandon treated you for years, and he thought Harold had probably known what he was doing." She glanced at me sideways. "My dad doesn't say a lot, but when he does, he's usually right." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice right at that moment. "I just wanted you to know," Rebecca said, "in case you were worried about where people stood." I came home from Phoenix the day after Christmas with a clearer sense of what I was up against. Brandon was not simply challenging the legal structure. He was building a case in the court of family opinion, recruiting allies, laying the groundwork for a narrative in which I was the villain, in which a widow had manipulated a dying man and stolen from his rightful heir. I called Victor the morning I got back. "I know," he said, before I'd finished explaining. "Richard Coates has been making calls to Frank Sorensen, to Jim Albright, to 2 of Harold's former board members. He's looking for testimony that supports the undue influence claim." "And?" Frank told him, as politely as a man like Frank knows how, to go to hell. Jim was less polite. I heard a quiet satisfaction in Victor's voice that I appreciated. The former board members are being more cautious. They don't want to be involved. But they're not ruling it out. No, they're not ruling it out. I stood in Harold's study and looked at the green archival boxes and thought about the word theft. Brandon had used it to Dennis. He genuinely believed it, I thought. That was the most disturbing part. He had spent so many years being certain of his own rights, so many years treating the company as an extension of himself, that someone else holding a piece of it felt like robbery. He couldn't see the 33 years I had put into it. He couldn't see the work, the records, the contracts I had managed and the numbers I had caught, and the decisions I had supported and sometimes saved Harold from making. He couldn't see any of it because he had never looked. But January was when things accelerated. 2 events happened within the same week, and together they changed the character of everything. The first was Margaret. She called me on a Tuesday evening, and her voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, tightly controlled, the way a person sounds when they are managing something that is frightening them. "I need to meet with you in person," she said, not on the phone. We met the next morning at a coffee shop on Ridgeline Avenue, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and too much noise, which I suspected was deliberately chosen for the privacy its noise provided. Margaret was 53, Korean-American, with 20 years at Whitmore Industries, and a reputation for being the kind of executive assistant who actually ran the operations while the executives took credit for it. Harold had trusted her completely. So did I. She sat down across from me and put a manila envelope on the table between us, but she kept her hand on top of it. "I need to tell you something first," she said. "I almost didn't come. I've been going back and forth for 2 weeks." "I'm glad you did. Brandon doesn't know I'm here, and I'd like to keep it that way." "Of course." She looked at me steadily for a moment, as if measuring something. Then she moved her hand from the envelope. Inside were printed copies of internal communications, emails, memo chains, one annotated spreadsheet. I went through them slowly while Margaret drank her coffee and watched the room. What I was reading was not a surprise exactly. It was the confirmation of something I had suspected without the documentation to prove it. Over the preceding 6 weeks, Brandon had been in active negotiations, not preliminary, not exploratory, but active and advancing, with a private equity group called Meridian Capital Partners. The communications made clear that Meridian was interested in acquiring Whitmore Industries in a leveraged transaction that would have given Brandon a substantial personal payout while stripping the company of its core assets, centralizing what remained, and reducing the workforce by what one email estimated as 40%. 125 jobs. People Harold had known by name. I set the papers down. My hands were steady. I was a little surprised by that. "How far along is this?" I asked. "The term sheet is drafted," Margaret said quietly. "He's been keeping it off the company's official communication systems, but these came through a personal account he sometimes accesses from the office server. I want to be very clear that I did not go looking for these. They came to me because I manage his calendar, and he CC'd his personal account on a meeting request by mistake, and when I cross-checked the attendee list, I recognized 2 names from Meridian's public roster." "You're protected," I said. "Whatever Victor needs from you in terms of how you came across these—" "I know," she said. "I've already spoken to a lawyer." She picked up her coffee cup. "Eleanor, those 125 people, some of them have been at the company for 15, 20 years. Harold knew their kids' names." "I know," I said. "He can't do this." "He can't," I said. "He's about to find out why." The second event happened 3 days later, and this one I was not ready for. Claudia came to Hartwell House. She called first, which surprised me. She asked if she could come by, and something in her voice was different from her usual careful social tone. Stripped down, uncertain in a way that Claudia, who was one of the most composed people I had ever met, almost never allowed herself to sound. She arrived at 11 in the morning, and I made tea because I didn't know what else to do. And we sat in the kitchen at the table that had once been Harold's breakfast table, and for a full 2 minutes, neither of us said anything. Claudia was 41, dark-haired, from a family that had money going back several generations and knew how to carry itself accordingly. She had married Brandon when he was 32, and I had always thought she was sharper than he gave her credit for. She saw things. She noted things. She had just, in 11 years of marriage, chosen to align herself with Brandon's version of reality because it was easier. I could see, sitting across from her that morning, that something had shifted. "He doesn't know I'm here," she said. Exactly what Margaret had said. People were coming to me in secret. I found that significant. "Okay," I said. "The Meridian deal." She wrapped both hands around her tea. "I found out 2 days ago. He hadn't told me. I found papers in his briefcase." "What did you say to him?" I said I thought it was a mistake. I said Harold had spent 30 years building those relationships, and that you don't just... She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He told me I didn't understand business. He told me it was the right move for the family's financial future." "What do you think?" She looked up at me. "I think he's scared. I think he's been scared since the will reading, and this is what Brandon does when he's scared. He moves fast and breaks things and calls it decisiveness." She paused. I also think he knows about the benchmark violation. He knows this would trigger it, and I think part of him might want it to. That surprised me. Why? Because then it's your decision. Then he can tell himself it was taken from him. Her voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Brandon has been telling himself that story his whole life. That things get taken from him. That he's owed more than he gets. It's exhausting to be close to. I don't think you'd know that. I looked at her. I've been in his orbit for 33 years, Claudia. She flinched slightly. Yes, I suppose you have. She set the cup down. I'm not here to apologize for him. I don't think I'm capable of that today. I'm here because I have a 12-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son. And if this deal goes through and the company collapses and Brandon's involved in a legal challenge, their lives get... She stopped again. Her composure was holding, but barely. I'm asking you, as his wife, as the mother of his children, is there a version of this where you don't destroy him? The question sat on the table between us like something physical. I thought about Harold's letter, the one locked in the desk. You will know when and if that time comes. I thought about what he'd said about Brandon. You are capable of more than what you have been. There has always been a version of this where I don't destroy him, I said carefully. That was Harold's intention. The 12 months exist because Harold believed in the possibility that Brandon could do this right. I met her eyes. But I cannot protect Brandon from himself. If he signs that term sheet, the benchmark is violated and my legal obligation takes over. Can you talk to him? We've talked. Every time we talk, he tells me I'm trying to take what's his. He's wrong, she said quietly. It was the first time I had heard Claudia say that about her husband, directly and without softening, and it landed in the room with a weight she clearly felt. I know he's wrong. I've known it since the reading. What he did was right. Brandon isn't ready. He may never be ready for this. She picked up her tea and then put it down without drinking. I don't know what to do with that. I had no easy answer for her. The honest thing I could offer was this. The company isn't going anywhere. If Brandon can stop himself from signing that deal, he still has 10 months to prove his father wrong about his judgment. That's still possible. She nodded. She didn't look convinced. She left 20 minutes later, and I stood in the kitchen after she'd gone and felt the particular discomfort of a situation where you are holding all the cards and still cannot fix the underlying thing. Claudia's children were 9 and 12. Harold's grandchildren, technically, though he had rarely been allowed to be close to them. I thought about that. Then I called Victor. The Meridian term sheet, I said when he answered. I need you to send a formal trustee notice to Brandon today. Not a warning. A notice that any signed agreement with Meridian Capital Partners will constitute a material benchmark violation and trigger immediate review of operational control. I need it in writing, I need it documented, and I need it delivered before the end of business. Victor was quiet for a moment. That's a significant step. I know. It will escalate things considerably. Victor. I looked out the kitchen window at the January garden, dead and brown and waiting. He is negotiating to sell Harold's company to a private equity firm that will lay off 125 people. Harold's people. The notice goes today. Yes, Victor said. It does. Book. The notice was delivered to Brandon's office at 3:47 that afternoon. Margaret texted me 2 words at 4:01. He knows. Brandon called at 4:15. I let it go to voicemail. Then I called back at 4:45 because I had learned something over the preceding 2 months about the timing of these conversations, that it was better not to take them in the first heat, that the 4 30-minute cooling period, small as it was, made a difference. You can't do this, was the first thing he said. It's been done, I said. Victor's filing is on record. You are... He stopped. I could hear him breathing. Do you understand what I'm trying to accomplish? I'm trying to build the company's future. Meridian has resources we don't have, capital we can't access independently. At the cost of 125 jobs and Harold's distribution network and everything he built over 30 years. At the cost of an outdated structure that can't compete in the current market. His voice had the heat of a man who has rehearsed this argument. Eleanor, you are not a business person. You were an accountant. You helped Harold with the books. That does not qualify you to make strategic decisions about Brandon. My voice came out flat and clear. Stop. He stopped. I was an accountant who managed Whitmore Industries' internal finances for 12 years. I was in every strategic meeting Harold had from 1993 to 2005. I reviewed every major contract this company signed in its first decade. I am not an outside party making uninformed decisions, and I would strongly suggest that before you say that to me again, you think very carefully about what a court would make of it. The silence was long. The Meridian discussions are over, he said finally. His voice had gone to somewhere cold and flat that I recognized. It was the voice Brandon used when he had lost an engagement and was already calculating the next move. Fine, you've won this round. Are you happy? I'm not keeping score, I said. I never was. Everyone keeps score, Eleanor. No, I said. They don't. That's what you've never understood about your father. He wasn't keeping score with you. He was trying to protect something he loved. Another long silence. This one felt different, less strategic, more human. He loved the company, Brandon said, and under the flatness of his voice was something that cracked at the edges. More than he loved me. The words fell into the space between us, and I felt the full weight of what they carried. 30 years of it, all the ways Harold's attention had been divided, all the times the company had won the competition for his presence that Brandon had never agreed to enter. I could have said, that isn't true. I could have said, you misread him. Both things would have been at least partially right. What I said instead was, that's a conversation you deserve to have with him, and he should have had it with you. That's the part I can't fix, Brandon. I'm sorry. He didn't respond. After a moment, the call ended. I set the phone down on Harold's desk, in the study, in the house that had good bones and held its secrets and was slowly, room by room, becoming mine. Outside, the January dark pressed against the windows. Inside, the 4 green archival boxes sat on their shelf, fully known now, fully mapped. I had read everything Harold had left me. I knew the structure of what I was holding. What I didn't know yet was how Brandon would come back from what I had just taken away from him. And he would come back. I had known Brandon long enough to be certain of that. Men like Brandon didn't absorb a loss and recalibrate quietly. They rebuilt the offense. They found another angle. I just didn't know yet what that angle would look like. I found out in February. February arrived the way bad news often does, quietly, with no warning in the weather. I had spent January in a state I can only describe as armed stillness. After the Meridian notice, Brandon had gone quiet in a way that was more unsettling than the confrontations. He stopped calling. Richard Coates stopped sending documents to Victor. The legal noise that had been a constant background frequency since November simply ceased. And I had lived long enough and known Brandon long enough to understand that silence from that direction was not peace. It was preparation. I kept going. I planted the early seeds in the back garden, the cold, hardy ones, the ones Harold had always called Eleanor's optimism crops because they went in the ground before there was any reasonable certainty that spring was coming. I cooked real meals instead of the functional things I had been eating since October. I called Dennis twice, Rebecca once. I drove out to the company twice, not to interfere but to be seen, to walk through the building with Margaret, to stop and talk to people I had known for years, to be present in a way that cost nothing and established everything. Margaret told me that morale was unsteady. The lateral moves Brandon had made with the senior department heads were causing friction. The new people he'd installed didn't have the relationships, didn't know the rhythms, and the floor-level staff could feel the difference. 3 people had submitted resignations in January. Not a crisis, not yet, but a signal. The kind of signal Harold would have read in a day and corrected in a week. Brandon had not corrected it. I noted it. I filed it. I waited. The call came on a Tuesday in the second week of February, not from Brandon, not from Victor, from a journalist. His name was Paul Garrett, and he worked for the Millhaven Courier's business desk, a desk I had always thought of as a minor operation, the kind that covered Chamber of Commerce luncheons and ribbon cuttings and the occasional medium-sized local scandal. Paul Garrett's voice was young and careful, with the particular careful energy of a person who has been given a bigger story than they're used to and knows it. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I wanted to give you the opportunity to comment before we run a piece. I sat down. What piece? We've received information suggesting that the estate of Harold Whitmore may be the subject of a legal challenge related to the validity of certain trust documents. We've also received information suggesting that there are questions about Harold Whitmore's mental capacity during the period when certain financial transfers were made. A pause. The information was provided by a source close to the Whitmore family. I was quiet for a moment, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I needed a second to feel the full shape of what Brandon had just done. He hadn't gone back to the courts. He hadn't come back at me through Victor. He had gone to the press. He had taken the undue influence claim, the claim that I had manipulated a dying man, and handed it to a local journalist so it could be processed into a story that would exist in public before any court had touched it. It was, I had to admit, a move I had not anticipated. "Mr. Garrett," I said, "how long do I have before you publish?" "We're planning to run Thursday. I wanted to reach you today so you have time to respond." "I appreciate the call. I'll have Victor Hale, the estate attorney, reach out to you directly. He'll have a formal response and will be able to provide documentation." I paused. "I would also ask, as a matter of journalistic practice, that before you publish anything about Harold Whitmore's mental capacity, you review the medical documentation from the period in question. Victor can provide it." "Of course," Paul Garrett said. He sounded slightly off balance, which I took to mean he had expected defensiveness and was recalibrating for something more measured. "One more thing," I said. "Do you know who provided the information?" A pause. "I'm not able to share that." "I understand," I said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm just going to say, for the record and for your own evaluation of the source, that I have spent 33 years in this family and in this company, and I have never once made a decision about Harold Whitmore's business affairs for personal gain. The documentation will reflect that. I think once you've reviewed it, you'll have a clearer sense of what this story actually is." I hung up and called Victor before I'd put the phone down from my ear. Victor was, to his credit, not rattled. He had been an estate attorney for 34 years, and he had seen the full range of what grieving, frightened, entitled family members did when a will didn't produce the outcome they expected. He told me he would contact Paul Garrett within the hour and offer a comprehensive documentation package: the medical records, the notarized capacity assessments, the video statement, the independent legal oversight letters. "This won't go anywhere as a story," Victor said. "The documentation is too clean. Any editor who looks at it will pull back." "But it's already out there," I said. "Someone at the Courier knows about it. Other people know about it. The allegation exists now, whether it gets published or not." "Yes," Victor said. He didn't try to minimize that. "It does." I sat with the phone in my hand after I hung up and thought about what Brandon had done and what it cost him to do it. Not strategically. The strategic cost was something I could calculate, but personally. To take a story about your own father's mental decline to a newspaper, to use it as a weapon, to introduce publicly the idea that the man who built something over 30 years couldn't be trusted with his own decisions in his final 2 years. That cost something. Even if you told yourself it was business, even if you constructed every possible justification, it cost something human. And I thought about the 9-year-old and the 12-year-old, Brandon's children, Harold's grandchildren, who would grow up in a family where the story of their grandfather's final years was a legal dispute, where the word manipulated had been attached to a dead man's name in the local paper. I was angrier than I had been at any point in the previous 3 months, more than the Meridian deal, more than the undue influence claim in Richard Coates' 40-page document. This was different. This was public. This was Harold. I made a decision in that moment that I want to be honest about, because it wasn't clean and it wasn't entirely noble. I decided that I was done being the patient one. I had been patient because Harold had asked me to be, and because I believed in the possibility that Brandon could course correct. I had held back, absorbed the hits, operated through proper channels, given him time and room and more grace than he had ever extended to me. He had just put Harold's name in a newspaper column about mental incapacity. I was done waiting for him to find his better self. I called Frank Sorensen. Frank was 71, retired but still connected, still trusted by the people who mattered in Millhaven's business community. He had been at Harold's side for 20 years. He had told Richard Coates to go to hell within days of the will reading. He was, as far as I was concerned, the closest thing I had to an ally with standing in the world Brandon operated in. I saw the call come through, Frank said when he picked up. His voice was warm and direct, the way it always was. I figured you'd call. Garrett called me too, looking for background. What did you say? I told him Harold Whitmore was the sharpest man I knew for the last 2 years of his life, that the trust arrangement was exactly the kind of careful, long-game thinking Harold was known for, and that anyone suggesting otherwise didn't know Harold or was lying. A pause. Then I may have said a few other things that weren't entirely printable. I almost smiled. Thank you, Frank. Eleanor. His voice shifted, became more direct. You need to think about going on offense. Brandon has been setting the narrative since November. He's been quiet for 6 weeks, and everyone thought it meant he was backing down. He wasn't backing down, he was going around you. I know. What do you have in terms of documentation on the company's current state? I thought about Margaret's manila envelope, the emails and the spreadsheet, the communication trail from the Meridian discussions, the 3 resignation letters, the performance data I had been quietly assembling since December. I have enough, I said. Then use it, Frank said simply. Harold didn't build what he built by waiting for the other side to make every move first. The Courier piece ran Thursday morning. It was smaller than I had feared, half a column, below the fold, hedged with qualifiers and balanced with Victor's response and Frank's quote. Paul Garrett had done the right thing. He had looked at the documentation and written accordingly. The headline was something neutral about an estate dispute, the kind of headline that gets read by people directly affected and nobody else. But Brandon had miscalculated the effect. By Thursday afternoon, 3 of Harold's former board members, the ones who had been cautiously uncommitted in December, had called Victor, not to offer testimony against me, to offer support. They had seen the article. They had seen Harold's name used that way, and whatever ambivalence they'd had about getting involved had cured itself overnight. Jim Albright called me directly. He was 74 and had known Harold since before I had. That boy, he said, and the 2 words contained 30 years of observation. That boy just made enemies he can't afford. I'm sorry it went this way, I said. Don't be sorry. Just finish it. Finish it. I had been trying not to think in those terms. I had been trying to hold on to Harold's framing, the 12 months as an opportunity, not a countdown. But Jim Albright was right. Brandon had moved this into a different territory. He had made it personal in a way that the legal structure couldn't fully contain. It was time to look at what I actually had in terms of the benchmark violations. I spent 2 days with Victor going through everything. Margaret's documentation, the performance data, the resignation letters and their stated reasons, the email trail from the Meridian discussions, the department restructuring and its operational impact, the supplier relationships that had wobbled and in 2 cases broken down entirely during Brandon's first 3 months. The picture that emerged was not ambiguous. Brandon had, in aggregate, produced evidence of violations on 3 of the 7 benchmark categories. Individually, each one could be argued around. Richard Coates was good at his job, and he would argue. But together, with the supporting documentation laid out in sequence, the pattern was clear. This was not a man who had stumbled while learning an unfamiliar role. This was a man who had made systematic decisions that prioritized his own short-term positioning over the company's health and the people within it. Victor laid a 12-page summary on his desk between us and looked at me over his reading glasses. This is sufficient, he said. It's more than sufficient. If you want to invoke the benchmark clause and initiate the transfer of control, the documentation supports it. I looked at the 12 pages, at the 3 resignation letters from people who had worked at Whitmore Industries for over a decade, at the supplier breach notifications, at the Meridian email chain that ended with the term sheet, drafted and saved but, just barely, unsigned. Can we give him the documentation first? I asked. Victor looked at me carefully. What do you mean? Before we file the formal invocation. Can we send him the summary? Let him see what we have. Give him the chance to... I stopped, thought about how to say it. Harold said he wanted this to be an opportunity. I want to be able to say when this is over that I gave Brandon every chance, including the chance to make the decision himself. Victor considered this for a long moment. It could be read as a negotiating opening. His attorneys might try to use it. Let them try, I said. The documentation is what it is. Victor nodded slowly. I'll have it delivered tomorrow morning. What? Brandon came to Hartwell House 2 days later. He didn't call ahead. I heard his car on the gravel at 10 in the morning and looked out the kitchen window and stood there for a moment before I went to the door. He looked different from the last time I'd seen him in person, which had been the will reading 4 months earlier. He had lost weight, or sleep, or something that showed in the face in ways that are difficult to precisely name. He was wearing a coat I recognized as one Harold had given him years ago, a dark wool overcoat that was slightly too wide in the shoulders now. I opened the door before he knocked. We looked at each other for a moment on the porch. Can I come in? He said. Yes, I said. We went to the kitchen. I made coffee because I didn't know what else to do, and because it gave both of us something to do with our hands while we settled into the room. He sat at the table. He put the 12-page summary on the table between us. Victor's copy, which I could see had been read thoroughly, folded back at the corners, marked in places with Brandon's handwriting. You have enough, he said. Yes, he nodded, not agreeing with me, accepting a fact. There's a difference. I want you to know, he said, that the courier piece was Coates' idea. I approved it, so I'm not putting it on him. But the framing, the mental capacity angle, that was his strategy, not mine. It doesn't really matter whose idea it was, I said. It went out with your approval. No, he said. It doesn't matter. I know. He put both hands around the coffee mug I'd set in front of him. I want to apologize for that. Using Dad's... He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I approved it, and I did it anyway, and I'm telling you that because I think you deserve to hear it directly. I sat across from him and looked at my stepson. This man I had spent 33 years navigating, who had spent 33 years not seeing me. And I tried to locate the anger I had felt on Tuesday when I'd heard what the article contained. It was there still. But underneath it was something more complicated and older, the accumulated residue of all the years and all the dinners and all the times Harold had put his hand over mine under the table. What do you want, Brandon? He looked up. I want to know if there's another way. What does that mean? The formal invocation, the transfer of control. He spread his hands, a gesture that was more open than anything I had seen from him before. Is there a version of this that doesn't end with a filing? I thought about Harold, about the video statement sitting in the fireproof box, about what Harold had wanted at the bottom of all the legal architecture. Not Brandon punished, not me vindicated, but the company surviving and the people in it protected, and whatever was still salvageable between a father and a son carried forward by the people who remained. There might be, I said carefully, but it would require some things from you that I need you to understand are not negotiable. He nodded. Tell me. The department heads you moved, Keller and Pavich. They come back to their original roles. The people you installed in their place stay on in supporting positions if they're good, but Keller and Pavich run their departments again. I held his eyes. Second, you end any outstanding discussions with outside buyers, formally, in writing, through Victor. Not on hold. Ended. Third, the 3 people who resigned, you reach out personally, not HR, you. If any of them want to come back, you bring them back with the same seniority they left with. Brandon was quiet. I could see him calculating, not strategically this time, just processing. And what do I get? You get the remaining 7 months, I said. You get the chance to finish what Harold gave you the chance to start. You get to go into month 11 with a clean record instead of a formal violation filing. And if you finish the year with the company healthy, if Whitmore Industries is in better shape in November than it is today, I will recommend to Victor and the board that the transfer of permanent ownership proceed as Harold intended. And if I don't meet the benchmarks by November, then the documentation we already have, plus whatever accumulates between now and then, goes to Victor, and the transfer of control happens formally. I set my coffee down. Brandon, I'm not your enemy. I was never your enemy. I know you don't believe that, but it's true. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through his face that I had not seen before. Not the calculation, not the contempt, not the wounded pride. Something rawer than any of those things. He should have told me. Brandon said. His voice was low. Not the letter, not the legal structure. He should have sat down with me and said, Brandon, I'm worried about what you'll do with this. He should have said it to my face. You're right, I said. He should have. Brandon blinked. He hadn't expected me to agree. Harold loved you, and he was afraid of that conversation, I said. He was afraid of what it would do to you, and he was afraid of what your reaction would do to him. And so he did what people do when they're afraid of hard conversations. He found a way around it. He was wrong to do that. I think he knew it. I think that's part of what the letter was trying to say. The kitchen was very quiet. The furnace made its old familiar sound in the walls. Outside, the February trees were bare and gray and perfectly still. Keller and Pavich, Brandon said finally. They'll come back? If you ask them properly, they might not come back. They might not, I agreed. But you have to ask. He picked up the 12-page summary and folded it and put it in the inner pocket of Harold's coat. He stood up. At the kitchen door, he turned back. He was proud of you, he said. It came out slightly uneven, like something he had been holding for a while and had not entirely decided to release. He talked about you like, I used to think it was annoying, the way he talked about you. He said you were the smartest person he'd ever worked with. He said it more than once. I held very still. I thought he meant it as a compliment, Brandon said. It took me until recently to understand he also meant it as a warning. He looked at me for another moment. I'll call Keller this afternoon. He left. I heard the gravel under his tires as he backed down the drive. I sat alone in Harold's kitchen for a long time after that. Not processing, not planning, just sitting, just breathing. The February light came through the south-facing window the way it always did, thin and pale and trying its best. I thought about what Brandon had said. He was proud of you. Harold, who had been economical with praise in the way that some men of his generation were, who had showed his feelings in structural ways, in careful documents and locked drawers, and a trust registered inside an old house. He had apparently said it out loud to his son. The son who had spent 30 years resenting me. Harold had said it to him. I didn't know whether to be grateful or to be angry at the irony. I settled on something in between, which is probably closer to the truth of most things than either extreme. Outside, the February trees stood bare and waiting, and somewhere in the roots of the garden, under the cold ground, the seeds I had planted were doing the slow, invisible work of becoming something. Some things I had learned you cannot rush. You prepare the ground. You plant. You wait. The rest is out of your hands. Keller came back. It took Brandon 3 phone calls over 2 days. I know because Margaret told me, and because Keller himself mentioned it when I ran into him in the Whitmore Industries parking lot 6 weeks later, and he said, without me asking, he called me 3 times. 3rd call, he apologized. I didn't think he had it in him. He said it without malice, more like a man reporting something that had genuinely surprised him. I nodded and didn't say much because it wasn't my story to claim. Pavich took longer. She came back in April on the condition that her department's restructuring be rolled back entirely and her budget restored. Brandon agreed to both conditions in writing. I found out about it from Victor, who had been CC'd on the agreement per the terms we had established in February. I want to be honest about those months, February through October. They were not a transformation. They were not the story where the difficult person has a single moment of clarity and emerges reformed and grateful. That is not how people work, and it is not how Brandon worked. What happened was slower and more uneven than that, and there were weeks where I thought the whole arrangement was going to collapse under the weight of Brandon's resistance to being guided by anyone other than himself. In March, he made a unilateral decision about a supplier contract that technically stayed within the benchmark boundaries but contradicted a direction Harold had established years earlier, and that Frank Sorensen, who had quietly taken on an informal advisory role at my request, thought was short-sighted. Frank told him so directly. Brandon argued for 45 minutes, and then, 3 days later, quietly revised the contract along the lines Frank had suggested without ever acknowledging that he'd changed his mind. That was Brandon's version of learning. It looked like stubbornness from the outside. It was, I eventually understood, the only way he knew how to absorb correction. Sideways, privately, without the exposure of admitting he had needed it. I stopped expecting him to admit things. I started just watching for whether the decisions improved. Slowly, unevenly, with backslides that made me grip the edge of Harold's desk on more than one occasion, they did. The thing nobody tells you about being in a position of authority over someone who resents you is that the authority itself is exhausting. It would have been easier to simply exercise it, to take the violation documentation to Victor in February and file the formal invocation and have done with it. Clean, fast, legally defensible. Harold's design would have executed itself exactly as written, but Harold hadn't said do the easy thing. He had said take care of my company and the people in it. And taking care of something is not the same as controlling it. I had to learn that distinction as much as Brandon had to learn his. There were nights in that spring when I sat in the kitchen at Hartwell House and genuinely did not know if I was doing the right thing. When I wondered if Harold had overestimated me the same way he had perhaps overestimated Brandon, seen potential where there was only the willingness to try. Those nights were bad. I won't dress them up. I would make tea. I didn't drink and sit with the kitchen light on until the particular stillness of 2 a.m. settled the question. The only way it ever gets settled, which is by running out of the energy required to keep doubting. I would go to bed. I would get up in the morning. I would do the next thing. That is the least glamorous version of perseverance, and it is the truest one. Pause. In May, something happened that I had not anticipated and that changed the texture of the remaining months in ways I am still processing. Brandon called me. Not about the company, not about the benchmarks or the documentation or Richard Coates, who had by then gone very quiet. He called me on a Sunday evening, which was unusual, and after a brief silence he said, "Claudia told me what you said to her in February, that there was always a version of this where you didn't destroy me." I waited. "She said you meant it," he said. "I did." Another silence. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Okay." "Did my father, in those last 2 years when he was doing all of this, when he was setting up the trust and the documentation and all of it," he stopped, tried again. "Did he talk about me? What did he say?" This was the question I had known was underneath everything since November. Since the will reading, since the first phone call, since every confrontation and negotiation and tense exchange in between. This was what Brandon had actually been asking every time he said he should have talked to me. He hadn't wanted legal explanation. He had wanted to know what his father had thought of him in private, in the 2 years he was dying, when there was no more reason to perform. I had 2 choices. I could protect Brandon from the complicated truth, which was what Harold had done, and which had produced the situation we were currently living inside. Or I could be honest. "He said you were capable of more than you were showing," I said. He said that more than once. He wasn't angry when he said it. It was something closer to sad. He talked about specific moments with you when you were younger, when he thought he could see what you might become. He was holding on to those moments. I paused. He also said he had failed you in some specific ways that he couldn't go back and fix. He was clear about that. The line was quiet for a long time. "What ways?" Brandon asked. His voice was different, reduced to something younger than his 42 years. He thought he had given you authority before he'd given you the foundation for it. He thought he'd rewarded confidence when he should have required accountability. He blamed himself for some of what you became. He said that in the letter. Not in those exact words, but that was what he meant. He wrote that in the letter. Yes. I heard Brandon exhale. It was a long, effortful sound, the kind of breath a person releases when they have been holding something for much longer than a single phone call. "He should have said it to me," Brandon said. But this time when he said it, the accusation had drained out of it. It was just a fact, a grief. "He should have," I said. "I know." We stayed on the line for another minute without speaking. It was not uncomfortable. It was the first silence between us in 33 years that didn't have a current running underneath it. "The company is doing better," Brandon said finally, in a different tone, back to the surface, where he was more comfortable. "Q2 numbers are up 6% over the same period last year." "Margaret sent me the report," I said. "I thought she might." A pause, and in it I heard something that might, on another face, have looked like the beginning of a smile. "She's loyal to you." "She's loyal to the company," I said. Same thing Harold was. "Yeah," Brandon said. "I'm starting to understand that." He hung up. I sat with the phone for a moment and then looked out the kitchen window at the May garden, which was finally, unambiguously alive. The beds full and green, the early flowers doing what flowers do when you've given them enough time, and the ground has finally warmed. Harold's optimism crops. Still coming up. The formal benchmark review happened on November 14th, 1 year and 1 month after Harold's death, and exactly 12 months after the will reading. Victor convened the meeting in the same office, with the same tall windows overlooking the river. Present were Victor and Priya, myself, Brandon, Frank Sorensen in his informal advisory capacity, and 2 independent auditors Victor had retained to evaluate the financial performance benchmarks without bias. Richard Coates was not there. Brandon had parted ways with him in August. I learned about it from Claudia, who had mentioned it briefly in a phone call about something unrelated to the legal proceedings, in the way that people mention things they consider already settled. I didn't ask for details. It told me enough. The review took 2.5 hours. The auditors presented first the financial performance data, the employee retention numbers, the contract status report. Then Victor reviewed the conduct benchmarks against the documented record. Then Frank offered his assessment, which was thorough and fair in the way that Frank was always thorough and fair, noting both the places where Brandon had fallen short in the first quarter and the places where the subsequent 3 quarters had shown genuine correction. I sat at the window again. The same chair. The river was the same. I was not. When the presentations were finished, Victor looked at me across the table. "Eleanor, the decision is yours." I had known this moment was coming for 12 months. I had rehearsed, in my head, various versions of it. What I might say, what I might feel. In some of those versions, I was moved by the gravity of it. In some, I was angry at being placed in the position at all. In some, I was sad in a way that was really just Harold. In the actual moment, I was mostly tired. The good kind of tired, maybe. The kind that comes at the end of something long and difficult that you have carried as carefully as you knew how. I looked at Brandon. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, very still. He had the look of a man who has done what he could and is now in the part of the story where the doing is over and the judgment begins. Whatever he was feeling, he wasn't trying to hide it, which was itself different from the Brandon I had known. That Brandon had always hidden behind motion, the aggressive forward lean, the raised voice, the next move already loading behind his eyes. This one was just sitting. "The transfer proceeds as Harold intended," I said. "Full permanent ownership to Brandon, effective upon completion of the probate formalities." Victor nodded. He had already known. He had probably known in September when the Q3 numbers came in. But he waited because it was right for me to say it, for the record and for the room. Frank put his hand on the table briefly and then withdrew it. Brandon looked at me for a long moment. His jaw was set in the way it set when he was managing something he didn't want to show. I watched him work through it. "Thank you," he said finally. "Just that." "Thank Harold," I said. "He built the structure. You just had to decide what to do inside it." Brandon looked down at the table. "I almost blew it." "You did," I said, "multiple times." He looked up, and something passed across his face that I can only describe as startled. He had not expected me to agree that plainly, and the bluntness of it, I think, landed differently than gentleness would have. It landed like respect. "Yeah," he said, "I know." "But you didn't," I said. "That's what counts." We did not hug. We did not have the cinematic reconciliation moment. I want to be clear about that because the absence of it matters. It is the honest version of the ending, the one that doesn't insult what the previous year actually cost. We walked out of Victor's building into the November cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Brandon had a meeting at the company at 2 o'clock. I had nowhere to be in particular, which was its own kind of freedom. "I'll be in touch about the transition documentation," he said. "Victor has everything you need." "Right." He put his hands in his coat pockets. Harold's coat was gone. He'd stopped wearing it sometime in the summer, and I had not remarked on it. "Eleanor." He said my name and then seemed to run out of whatever came after it. "I know," I said. He nodded. He walked to his car. He did not look back, which was fine. Some people show you they've changed in the leaving, not in the goodbye. I stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. The river was behind me. Victor's building was behind me. Harold's careful, quiet, extraordinary plan had just completed its final execution. I stood there and let myself feel the full weight of it. The year, the documents, the late nights, the phone calls, the garden, the archival boxes, the kitchen table, the letter with the green wax seal. All of it. The grief and the anger and the exhaustion and the moments that were, despite everything, almost worth the cost of how they came to be. Then I walked to my car and drove home. I want to tell you what I know now that I didn't know a year ago. Not as a lesson, exactly. I'm skeptical of people who package pain into lessons too neatly because it suggests they've forgotten what the pain actually felt like. But as something I've arrived at, imperfectly, with the full awareness that I could be wrong. I know that Harold loved me in the way that some people love. Structurally, practically, through the architecture of what they build rather than only through what they say. That kind of love can look like silence from the outside. From the inside, once you understand what it was made of, it looks like the most deliberate thing you've ever seen. I know that I spent 33 years being easier to dismiss than I should have allowed. Not because I was weak, I wasn't weak, but because I thought accommodation was the same thing as grace, and it isn't. Accommodation is what you do when you want to keep the peace. Grace is what you extend after you've already held the line. I confused those two things for too long. I know that Brandon Whitmore is not a villain. He is a man who was given too much, too soon, and too little of the thing that actually mattered, and who spent decades filling that particular hole with the wrong materials. I am not certain he will ever fully understand the year he just lived through, but I think he understands more than he did. And I am less sure of this, but I think that Harold's grandchildren will have a father who is slightly different for having gone through it, slightly more accountable, slightly less convinced of his own entitlement. That is not nothing. In a family, in a generation, that is genuinely not nothing. I know that the old house is mine, not in the legal sense, though it is that too, but mine in the way that places become yours, through the mornings and the winters and the work you do in them, through the seeds you plant and the rooms you learn and the letters you find in locked drawers. Hartwell House has good bones, Harold said. He was right. So did the marriage. So I am slowly discovering, do I? There are a few things I should tell you about how it settled, practically, in the months after November. The Whitmore family trust remained intact. Harold's structure had given me the controlling shares with the provision that they could be managed separately from Brandon's operational ownership, meaning I remained a stakeholder with legal standing even after the transfer. This was not something I had negotiated. Harold had built it in from the beginning. I didn't fully understand why until I talked to Victor about it in December. He wanted to make sure you were never in the position of being pushed out, Victor said, even after the transfer, even if things went sideways later in ways he couldn't predict. He paused. He also thought you might be useful to the company in a formal capacity, if you wanted to be. I thought about that for several weeks. I thought about Margaret and the 3 people who had resigned and come back, and the department heads, and the 6% growth in Q2, and the national partnership Harold had been in early negotiations for before he died, which was still alive, still on the table, still possible if someone pushed it forward properly. I called Brandon in January. The national partnership, I said. The one your father was working on before he died. Where does it stand? A brief pause. Still viable. I've had 2 conversations with their team. They're interested, but we haven't pushed it to the next stage. I'd like to help push it, I said, in an official capacity. I'm not asking to run anything. I'm asking to use what I know and what Harold built to close a deal he spent 3 years working toward. The silence on the other end was long enough that I began to prepare for resistance. I'll have Priya draw up a formal consulting arrangement, Brandon said. If that works for you. That works for me. It was not a warm conversation. It was a functional one. But functional, I have learned, is underrated. Functional is 2 people who don't particularly like each other deciding to honor something larger than the dislike. That is its own kind of achievement. The national partnership closed in April of the following year. I was in the room for the final meeting, which was held at the Whitmore Industries offices, in the conference room I had helped Harold furnish 20 years before. Brandon led the negotiation. I sat at the far end of the table and said very little, which was correct. It was his meeting. his company, his deal to close. But when the other side's representative asked a specific question about the company's founding contracts and the historical distribution framework, Brandon looked at me, and I answered, and the meeting moved forward. Afterward, in the parking lot, Brandon stopped next to my car. "You knew the answer to that question before they asked it," he said. "Harold and I drafted those founding contracts," I said. "I remember everything we drafted." He stood with his hands in his pockets. The April air was cold and new. "He taught you everything." "We taught each other," I said. "That's how it works when it's real." Brandon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the building behind us, the Whitmore Industries building, with the name that had been in his family for 30 years, and that was now, officially, permanently, legally his. "I'm going to try to be better at it than I've been," he said. It wasn't a declaration. It was more like something a person says to themselves when someone else happens to be standing nearby. At the people part, the way Dad was. "You won't be like Harold," I said. "You're not Harold, but you can be good at it in your own way, if you decide to." He looked at me. "Do you think I will?" I thought about the third phone call to Keller, the 45-minute argument with Frank that ended in a quiet course correction 3 days later, the Sunday evening phone call in May, the look on his face in Victor's office when the year was finally done. "I think you might surprise yourself," I said. He nodded. He walked to his car. And this time, before he got in, he did look back. Not a wave, not a smile, just a look, brief and direct, the kind that acknowledges something without requiring it to be named. I got in my car and drove back to Hartwell House. That was 18 months ago now, as I'm telling this. The garden is doing what it does every year. Better than I expect, messier than I plan, reliable in the way that living things are when you give them decent ground and enough time. The soft spot on the porch steps got fixed last September. The furnace was replaced in October and works so well that I sometimes think the house feels slightly startled by its own warmth. I have Harold's study the way I want it now. I kept the desk and the bookshelves and most of the books. I moved his chair to face the window, which is different from how he had it. He liked to face the door, to see who was coming. I like to face the garden. Different people watch different things. The 4 green archival boxes are in the closet now, fully read, fully known. The fireproof box is still where Harold put it, still locked. Some things are worth keeping secure even when the emergency is over. Margaret is still at the company. She called me last week to tell me that Brandon had reorganized the senior management structure, properly this time, with input from department heads, and that the office felt different. "It feels like somewhere Harold would recognize," she said. It was the highest compliment she knew how to give, and I told her so. Claudia and I have coffee occasionally. It is not a friendship, exactly. We are too different for that, and there is too much history between our families for the relationship to be uncomplicated. But it is something. A warmth that was not there before. Her children, Brandon's 9-year-old and 12-year-old, Harold's grandchildren, came to the house in the summer, and I showed them the garden, and the 12-year-old, whose name is Sophie, asked me if I had planted everything myself. "Most of it," I said. "How do you know what to plant?" I thought about Harold and the seeds I put in the ground every February while the cold was still deciding whether to leave. I thought about the things you do before there's any reasonable certainty that spring is coming. "You start with what survives," I said, "and then you learn what you love." Sophie nodded like that made sense. Maybe it did. I want to leave you with the thing I have thought about the most in the 18 months since that November morning in Victor's office. Since I said the transfer proceeds and drove back to Hartwell House and sat in the kitchen until the good kind of tired put me to bed. I had been inside this family for 33 years. I had cooked the meals and managed the contracts and absorbed the slights and supported the decisions and loved the man who built it all. I had done all of that without demanding recognition because I had not thought recognition was something I needed. I told myself I was above the need for it. I told myself that the work was enough. But here's what I know now. The work is not enough. The work is important, but it is not the whole thing. You're allowed to ask to be seen. You're allowed to take up space in the rooms that your labor helped build. You're allowed to say, not with anger, but with the simple clarity of a person who has finally stopped apologizing for existing, "I am here. I matter. What I have done matters." Harold knew that. That was what the trust was, underneath the legal structure. It was Harold saying, I see you, I have always seen you, and I want to make sure the world has to see you too. I wish he had said it out loud more. I wish I had asked him to, but I am 61 years old, and I'm living in a house with good bones and a garden that comes back every year, and I hold 43% of a company that is doing what it was built to do. And I planted seeds this February in the cold ground before there was any certainty that spring was on its way. It came anyway. It always does. Not because things work out the way they should, not because the right person wins or the wrong person loses or justice arranges itself cleanly at the end. Those are the stories we tell because we need them. The true story is messier and slower and more human than that. The true story is you do the work, you hold the line, you extend grace where grace is warranted and hold your ground where it isn't. You plant the seeds, you wait. And then one morning, you walk out into the garden and find that something has come up that you were not entirely sure would make it through the winter. And that is enough. That is, I have finally learned enough.